Welcome to Closer to Venus. I'm Johnny Burke. Today's guest is Jennifer Gordon, a professional ballroom dancer, choreographer, actor, and writer of Gothic fiction, which in some cases was inspired by her own past life memories. Jennifer, welcome to the program.
Hey, Johnny. Thank you so much for having me.
So you do seem to have quite a few artistic pursuits. What inspired you to become a writer?
I think I was always a writer, to be honest. I was always telling stories and writing even when I was a little girl. I concentrated on poetry a lot, like during college and high school. But I always thought, eventually I'll write a novel, eventually I'll write a novel. And then one day I just stopped telling myself not to. And the rest is history.
I saw on your bio that it mentions you were a magician's assistant.
Yes. So everybody thinks that always means like I was put into a box and chopped in half, or, I was wearing like a coat filled with rabbits or things like that. But I worked for a performer who was more a mentalist or a psychic entertainer. So it was more readings, seances, theatrical seances, things like that. So I was never chopped in half, but I did get to wear some outfits that had like cool cloaks and feathery collars and things like that.
Well, that's a relief that you were never chopped in half. I didn't think of it that way. I just thought of some really gothy type backdrop where there's lots of red velvet and people dressed in black. And
It was that. It was that kind of, think early Victorian spiritualist movement, except modern day. So it was that.
that reminds me of a certain goth club I used to go to when I lived in Los Angeles. It's definitely that Victorian vibe in some of those clubs, without a doubt. I always thought, God, that is so weird. And then I finally figured it out. That came from a specific period. Did your interest in horror and perhaps the occult start with that, or did that happen before?
It happened before. I think my love of horror I blame on the fact that my cool uncle lived with us for a while when I was 10, and he had just moved from New York. It was Buffalo, New York, but all I heard was New York, and I thought, that's really cool. So I wanted to know everything he was doing, what he was reading. I wanted to know what his clothes looked like. So basically every time he was out of the house, I would go into his room and snoop like crazy. And one day I found a copy of Pet Sematary by Stephen King, which at that time had like that iconic 1980s cat cover. And I snatched that from his room and ran up to my room and hid behind my dollhouse and started reading Pet Sematary. So that is where the fascination with horror came from. I like to blame that. And the fact that I used to play in a cemetery because it was very close to my house.
Okay, so you had a cemetery close to your house and you had a cool uncle, which that definitely helps.
And then like I'm really pale. I know your listeners can't see how pale I am, but you can see how pale I am.
Right.
And I've got like long curly hair. When you look like this, you almost have to become a little obsessed with like Gothic and horror. It just was, I was built for it. Like a robot.
Kind of comes with the territory. So when you mentioned Pet Sematary, I couldn't help but think of the Ramones song by the same title. Yeah, that was actually one of their better songs, come to think of it.
Yeah, it really was.
Speaking of horror and music and so forth, what kind of bands were you listening to when you grew up?
I was really into like The Cure, Depeche Mode, Tori Amos. I did go through a big punk phase when I was obsessed with the Ramones and the Misfits and the Clash and the Sex Pistols, but mainly I was interested in The Cure and Depeche Mode and Nick Cave and pretty much anything Lou Reed I was obsessed with. I liked anything I loved Velvet Underground. Anything sad and British that might have been about drugs and might not have been. Loved The Cure. They were the first band that I think broke my brain when I listened to it.
One of the best bands I ever saw live, without a doubt.
The Disintegration tape, which I had when I remember it was 7th and 8th grade specifically, when I would just listen to it over and over again. It's one of the few tapes that I actually physically wore out, had to go back to the mall, buy another copy of it. I thought it was, and I still think, probably one of the most beautiful pieces of art that's out there. It's poetry. It still hurts my soul. It's so beautiful.
That was a great album. I think Disintegration was one of my favorites. Kiss Me, Kiss Me, Kiss Me came right before that.
That was my first Cure album as a young pre-teener. That's the thing that got me hooked. And I remember I was at a school dance where I didn't belong because I was very awkward. And a boy I liked had headphones in and was listening on a Walkman to something that wasn't being played. And he was just like dancing in the corner. And I said, "What are you listening to?" And he gave me his headphones and it was Kiss Me, Kiss Me, Kiss Me. And I just, I was in like 6th grade and I'd never heard music like that. And it was so much better than Moni Moni or Shout or whatever terrible thing they were playing at the dance. And I realized, well, that's the key to get through school dances, just to bring your own music and just hang out by yourself in the corner.
So you obviously like some very good bands. How much of an influence on your work was music, or was it art, or was it a combination of things?
It's a combination of things, really. When I write, I see it like a movie, and I don't know if that's like the theater person in me, but every movie has a soundtrack. So every novel I have has like a core group of songs that I think would be like in the character's head. So I listen to certain music when I write. Mostly I listen to, I don't know if you know the genre, you probably do, dark ambient music, which is electronic. It basically sounds like if a haunted house could express itself in art. So I listen to a lot of dark ambient. That's actually kind of my go-to genre now.
You're focusing on the Victorian Gothic. Was there anything in particular that steered you in that direction?
Well, my 2 books that are Victorian in nature, which are From Daylight to Madness and When the Sleeping Dead Still Talk, they are a series. What steered me in that direction was actually past life regression. And
you're reading my mind now. I get that.
Yeah, see, psychic. It was that because in one session, actually in 2 sessions, like almost 20 years apart, I saw the very first scene of that book, the book From Daylight to Madness. And it stuck with me like in the back of my head because I didn't really know what it was. And I believe in past life regression. I believe in past lives. But I know there are people out there who don't. And I'm fine with those people looking at me like, oh, okay, you saw this in a dream or whatever. I feel like for whatever it is, under hypnosis several times, I was always brought to a specific scene. And whatever that is, it was my brain or my memories telling me I needed to remember this and explore it to the best of my ability. And it just got trapped in my head like a song, like that scene. Who is this person? I knew her name. I knew this kind of 5 minutes of her life. Or my life, if you want to call it that.
It was one of your lives.
Yeah, it was. Because her name is Isabel in my book. It was Isabel in my hypnosis sessions. She kept coming back to her, little flashes. And though my book is a horror novel, everything I saw about her life wasn't a horror novel. It just ended up, I write horror. This is how the story expressed itself. But little flashes, little tiny things. And I made sure everything that I knew about her put in the book. And I put in the next book. And then I created a world around her.
I think it's fascinating that a book that you've written for any writer to get inspiration from memories that you can actually attribute to what you think is a past life. Really, really interesting stuff. What prompted you to do regression therapy? Was it suggested by someone, or did you just learn about it yourself?
I learned about it, and it's something I've been fascinated with since I think before I even understood what past lives were. I've always had incredibly vivid dreams, repetitive dreams of the same thing, of specific time periods that I didn't belong in. I've always had deja vu really intensely. And over my life growing up, several times, whether I was like at a beach and went to like a psychic, I had no less than 3 psychics over like 15 years all look at me and say, the veil between your memories and your past lives is so thin. And I had psychics say to me, what do you dream about? There was something in me, or there was an energy coming off of me that made people that I didn't know say that the veil between my lives was thin. So when I started kind of exploring past life regression, I did it a few times in my early 20s, and then later on, about 6 or 7 years ago for a while. I did it and I loved it. I thought it was therapeutic and inspiring and exhausting at times, but
That's what I've heard.
yeah, it kind of taught me how to trust in a lot of ways, because you really have to trust the person who's leading you through it. If you don't trust the person who's leading you through it, I don't think it'll work. Yeah, so that's where Isabel was. That's where she was 20 years ago. And then that's the first thing that came through the first time. I was regressed again many years later. It was right back to her.
What time period did Isabel live in? 1800s?
1800s. She died in 1873.
Really? You have the date?
I have the year and roughly the time of year, because it was one of the things I sort of experienced right before. I don't want to say I experienced her death, because I really didn't experience her death, but I experienced the things that led right before it several times. So my job as a writer and my job as a person is to kind of solve that mystery of the first memory I had of her, which was of her giving birth to a child in a cold apartment and having that child pass away, to the moment of her death less than a year later. What happened in between there? I had flashes, little bits, but none of it made perfect sense, because I don't know if you've ever had past life regression therapy, because sometimes you get things and it's just there and then gone, and you talk through it. I was lucky. I would always, people would record me so I could listen to it back and go, oh, that's really interesting, and kind of be able to meditate on it.
The audio tape is very important. And to answer your question, no, I haven't yet. I'm not sure if I'm going to divulge the results on one of these sessions, regardless of what.
You can come on my show and do it.
Yeah. I think that would be more appropriate, because I don't really want to talk about me. But going back to your regression sessions, Isabel lived in mid-1800s. Were you ever regressed farther back than that, to another life before?
Yes, I have. I've experienced things in the 1600s, in the 1700s. And then there was something that I don't even understand when it was, but I know it predated all of those things.
That's where it gets really interesting. Some people report memories that predate recorded history, and they don't know when it is. It's pretty cool when you think about it.
My husband has 2 tattoos on each of his wrists. He has a mountain and an ocean, and that came from an experience we had together, a past life regression thing, where he had said, I've known you since I was a mountain and you were just an ocean. And whether that's real or not, it gave us both this sense of that we did predate almost humanity in a way. There was some part of us that have, on a molecular level, have known each other.
I've never heard it explained quite like that, but I have talked to people that swear they have shared lives for the past 6,000 years.
Yeah.
What I'd like to see is to have these kind of discussions reach critical mass where it's almost as ridiculous not to believe in it as it is to believe in it.
We're not there, but that's how I feel. Sometimes I'm just how can we as a society be so limited in our scope of thought to think that this is all we have? We have this 70 years and that's it. Where does the energy go, even if you're a science person?
Have you dreamt of places where you know that it's familiar to you, but Jennifer Gordon's never been there?
Yes. Yes, I have.
How do you know it's not just your imagination and just a dream?
That's a really good question. I think when I have repetitive dreams of the same place that are not traumatic, it's not a nightmare, it's not anything. It's just literally either walking through a house or walking down a hallway. Almost like if you experience a ghost experience, or a haunting, most of the times the ghosts are just they're in a loop. They're walking to the kitchen sink. They're walking up or down the stairs. And that's sometimes what my dreams are. It's almost like it's more memory than dream. It's just an everyday thing, but it's always the same, in the exact same house or the exact same, sitting on a fence post and I see a lightning storm off in the distance, like heat lightning, and a farm. And it's the same, and it's not something I wake up from petrified. So it's not some kind of psychological thing where this is how my body is telling my brain to react to trauma, or it's just an everyday moment that I'm reliving over and over again, but I'm not dead.
Like you said, it's like an everyday moment that we lived, which a lot of them you don't forget. That's a very good point. Speaking of ghosts, have you had experiences with them?
I have, very much so. I'll tell one story and then I'll go back to the one about my father. I definitely believe in hauntings. I believe that some people are more connected to it, so they experience it more than others. But 2 years ago, I was in the Czech Republic. I was in Prague on a vacation, and my husband and I and a few other people took a ghost hunting trip into underground Prague. If anybody's been to the Czech Republic and been to Prague, in Old Town Square, Old Prague is underneath where Prague is now. So there's tunnels, labyrinths, whole rooms, whole houses completely underground. So we went on a tour of one that was the executioner's home, which was also connected to an old prison and a dungeon. But the executioner lived there with his family attached to that place. And our guide was incredible. She was a lovely woman. We all had, EMF meters. We had thermometers. We had everything. There was no electricity in the place. So we just had little lanterns, and sometimes we just turned them off and just sat in the space. But there was a part of the room, which was like the kitchen, they think, had this old deep well that's been years since it's been used. It's completely dried out. But there's a energy of a little girl near that well. And our guide always brings her little toys and leaves them there. And everybody's EMF meters usually light up when we're near this well. So she's telling us the story, and she's over by the well and nobody else is. And she's like, it's weird that my EMF meter's not going off. She's usually very active. And at that moment in time, I felt what I thought was my husband's hand in mine squeeze it. And then I looked to look at him, and he was across the room and there was nobody next to me. But then I felt this incredible pressure, like a little child's body lean against me. And then I looked at my EMF meter, which was in my other hand, and it was completely lit up. And I went, I think she's over here. And it was just so feeling her little hand in mine. And that was another experience, right when I met that guide, she was looking at our group and she was like, so who here believes? And there were people who were like, I don't believe. And people who were like, I might believe. And then she looked at me and she went, oh, this is going to be fun. She knew. She's just like, okay, you're psychic. So I felt this little girl. That's the one that I've honestly felt the most like a real person.
Does it make sense that people that have past life memories are sensitive to things like ghosts and that kind of energy?
I mean, I'm certainly no expert, but I think so. I think they are, and I don't know if it's because we're gifted in some way or if it's just that we're willing and open to it. Because I guess I'm definitely willing and open to it.
Speaking of the spirit world, did you have experiences like this when you were younger, or did it happen a little bit later?
I think my first experience that I can really remember, I was about 11 or 12, so right around that puberty time.
Any experiences with loved ones that have passed, anything like that? Or?
Yeah, but I was older. I was in my 20s when my father passed away. He lived in our family home, and during the last months of his life, he had a brass bell that he would ring to get people's attention because he didn't have enough oxygen really to speak. So he passed away. About a year later, my mother moved to Florida and I moved into that family home. And for months, in the middle of the night, I would hear the bell. The person I was dating at the time heard the bell. He didn't believe in ghosts. He still heard the bell. He'd wake up and be like, what is that? And I was like, it's my dad. I know it's my dad. And I would go down into his room and I'd just be like, I know, I hear you. I don't know what you want. Sometimes I was like, you're kind of scaring me or you're keeping me awake. But every night it would happen. And then I talked to somebody who was considered themselves a ghost hunter. And she said, he might be confused because he doesn't know where your mom is. Because she left very suddenly. She just decided, I'm moving to Florida, and moved. So the next time I heard it, I went down into his bedroom and I said, Mom's okay. She's in Florida, if that's what you're wondering. I'm fine. And then I didn't hear it again. I heard it on rare occasions, usually when I was very, very upset. If I was crying at night, alone in my room, I'd hear it. Or at times that I was really needing somebody, I would hear it, but it stopped being a nightly thing.
So it would appear that's just that much more evidence that there's definitely a connection between us mortals and the spirit world.
I agree. Yes.
Seems like it. Now, with the regression, can you walk us through what happened, what it felt like, and how you knew it wasn't just your imagination?
The first time I knew it wasn't my imagination was when, and then I'll backtrack to what it felt like, was when I came out of it and I thought it didn't work. I thought I had fallen asleep and the person played the recording. And it didn't even sound like my voice. And I was just like...
That's trippy.
Like, I'm getting chills now when I think about it, because I just remember thinking, oh, I'm sorry, I fell asleep. I didn't realize I was that tired. And the person who did it was like, you were not sleeping.
What was that like?
That was weird. That was probably the weirdest one, because there was even a moment that first time that I had the recording that you can tell it sounded not like my voice. It sounded much younger. And I was doing something like strange with my breathing. I was like, and he had to like calm me down. He was like, it's okay. Wherever you are, we can come right out of it if you want to. On the recording, I remember going, no, it's okay. I'll be fine. So that was the first time I really, really, really knew for me that it was real. How it felt for me to go under was always, when you're about to fall asleep, but you're fully awake and you kind of like twitch. It felt like living in that world. I'm not an easy person to relax. I'm a lot. So getting me to a point where I could relax was a lot of it. Usually about 20 minutes of the sessions were just like getting me to go under. And how I usually responded, because for some reason, I really respond to like houses, hallways, doorways. I don't respond to, you're dipping your toes in water, you're getting more relaxed, relax your knees, relax your blah. I don't respond to that. I very much respond to walk down this hallway, take a right. Literally, they would just have me like walking in a building until I was completely relaxed, and I would just describe what I saw. And then eventually I would see a door every time. The door was many times different. I could tell when it was Isabel's door. Her door, I remember. I remember it in my head, but the doors were always different. And then it was just, that kind of, and I hate to say typical, but open the door, walk through it. What do you see? Sometimes it didn't make sense.
Did you know where it was? Was it in America? Was it in Europe?
Sometimes I didn't know. Isabel, it was hard to tell. When I wrote her story, I wrote it in the United States just because for research purposes, it was easier for me. And it very well could have been the United States. A few people had accents, but it was the 1800s. Everybody had accents because people were very new to this country. And the way the landscape looked, because I've done a lot of research, I always thought it was like either, the coast of England or the coast of New England. It was very cold, rocky, very northern Atlantic water. So the ocean was always gray. It was never blue. It wasn't a white sandy beach. It was stone and water.
I was getting a New England vibe, Connecticut, Rhode Island.
Yeah, I said it in Maine because I was just like, it seemed that kind of feeling. And most of the accents I heard tended to be Irish / Northern English. When I finally grasped what year it was, I did some work genealogically and figured out who was working where in New England during this time period and what jobs they had and what were the residents of, because there was like a memory I had of her being probably about 14 and living in like a poorhouse or a group home, and she was the one in charge of polishing the banister. So I tried to figure out who was in these places, who ran them, who were the other children, and everything came back. It was mostly Irish. There's a good chance my hunch is right, and it's Maine.
I don't know why I just thought of witches when you were talking about this. That whole period predates that by at least 100 years or so. But so this was obviously a very big influence on your writing. Is it possible then that many other people do the same exact thing? They're drawing on past life memories without even knowing about it?
I do think that's possible. I 100% believe that's possible. I talk to a lot of writers. I have a podcast where I talk to writers, and so many writers say the same thing, and that's they come up with an idea, or they think they come up with an idea, and they start working, and then they say, I almost go into a trance, and the characters take over, and the characters make choices that I didn't think they were going to make, and the characters told this story, I didn't tell this story. And we think that that's normal because we're writers. I also think it's a really good chance that your memories, or there's something inside of you knows this already, and it's telling you the story.
With your work, how much of it is based on your past life memories and how much is fictionalized based on your past life and you built a world around them?
For the book From Daylight to Madness, and the second part to it, When the Sleeping Dead Still Talk, From Daylight to Madness has, besides the horror elements to it, which are not supernatural but more psychological, that one is, I would say, 50% based on what I believe to be true about my past life and 50% fictional. The second part to that story is more fictionalized because I don't want to give too many spoilers away about the book, but Isabel may or may not be alive during that second book.
Yeah, okay. But generally speaking, it was inspired by not someone else's past life memories, but
mine.
They were yours.
And the character that When the Sleeping Dead Still Talks is focused on was somebody that I also met in those same memories of Isabel's, but it just wasn't Isabel. It was somebody Isabel knew, and I wanted to tell his story just as a tribute to him, even though that is mostly fictionalized because it wasn't me, so I don't know that much about him.
I think what you were trying to do there was imagine a friend that Isabel would have.
Yes.
Am I right? Right. Okay, so what is the genre, or is it a micro-genre of fiction that's based on past lives?
I don't know if there is a genre for it. It would have to be a micro-genre. I have a very good friend who's a fellow writer, and every day we talk about our own work, and we're always just like, what genre do I put this in? And that's one of those things where I was like, past life psychological Gothic horror, past life literary historical fiction, lyrical, ghost fiction, past life, regression therapy, and
Akashic fiction? I don't know.
I know. So, and then you go to Amazon, you're like, I'll just look at the categories they have. And I'm like, well, it doesn't fit into any of these.
It doesn't exist.
They have social security fiction is something, but they don't have past life fiction.
Actually, you might have just coined the phrase. Sooner or later, I think someone is going to come up with that genre or subgenre, microgenre. With some of these bands these days have all these hyphenates I've never even heard of. But I guess they felt that they had to do that, just as someone like you might say, I write past life fiction.
It is a good one. It is a good one. For those books, I have another book that is out that won some awards for horror, but I always call that one grief fiction or grief horror, because it's not typical horror. It's about the grieving process, which is horrifying. So I'm just like, it's grief horror? And people are like, is that a thing? And I'm like, yeah, it's a thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sure. It should
Sounds
be.
like it. With your experience with diving into the past lives and the regression therapy and all that you've learned, what are the most important takeaways for the people that believe and even for the people that don't believe?
Oh, gosh, that we are older beings than we think we are. Our energy has predated us. And again, no matter what you believe, if you believe that when you die and there's nothing there, or you go to heaven or whatever it is, the molecules that make us up are timeless. They're going to go on without you. They were here before you. And like the rings in a tree, you can tell a story with what we have as beings inside of us and be willing to at least entertain the thought of it and listen to your dreams.
Good description. Jennifer, thanks so much for joining us today. How do our listeners find you online?
The easiest place is just to go directly to my website, which is jenniferannegordon.com, and that's Anne with an E, like Anne of Green Gables, for all you Anne of Green Gables fans. So that has the links to all of my books. It has the links to my social media. It has some paintings I've done, some photos I've taken, and of haunted places. So that's the best place.
You've been listening to Closer to Venus. I'm Johnny Burke. If you enjoyed today's episode, please consider subscribing. If you really liked it, please consider leaving us a review on iTunes. Thanks again for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.